Welcome to Unholy Histories, the Humanist Heritage podcast brought to you by Humanist UK. I'm Andrew Copson, Chief Executive of Humanist UK.
And I'm Madeline Goodall, Head of the Humanist Heritage Project.
We're the hosts of this new podcast series where we will be speaking with experts about Britain's humanist history,
uncovering the people, events and ideas that have shaped both humanist thought and our national life.
When we think of the progressive reforms of the 1960s, we often picture youth in revolt, the sexual revolution, rock and roll and women's liberation, all presenting a picture of a sudden chaotic explosion of freedom. But what if the real blueprint for change arose from something quite different? What if it was, in fact, meticulously plotted across decades by a remarkable network of intellectuals, activists and friends, co-conspirators in a plot to change the world? Today on Unholy Histories, we are diving into what H.G. Wells called the open conspiracy, and a decades-long campaign by 94 leading humanists who set out to amend the nation's laws, overthrowing moral theocracy in favour of humanitarianism, individual autonomy, and internationalism. To explore this story, we're joined by Callum Brown, a social and cultural historian best known for a book in 2001 called The Death of Christian Britain, in which he argued that Christian culture dominated Britain later than is often supposed, until the 60s, but then crashed in a tumult of liberalism and reconstruction of the progressive self. In the last 10 years, Callum's research has focused on the central role of humanism in the mid-20th century collapse of religion. He's the author of 4 books on different aspects of humanist change: Becoming Atheist in 2017, an oral history of the change in the Western self for the 60s generation; The Battle for Christian Britain in 2019, which looked at the struggle between humanists and Christians for control of the entertainment's licensing system and the BBC; The Humanist Movement in Modern Britain in 2023, co-written with David Nash and Charlie Lynch, which provided a history of the movement from the 1890s to the 2020s, and now a 4th book entitled 90 Humanists and the Ethical Transition of Britain in 2026, in which Callum shows how a group of 94 humanist intellectuals conspired together between 1930 and 1980 to very successfully liberalise the ethical laws of Britain. It's this book which we'll explore in more detail today. And as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Madeline Goodall.
Thank you very much for having me.
Should we start maybe by asking you simply to tell us something, perhaps about your work up to now, but maybe particularly the open conspiracy that the title of your book refers to? What are we talking about here?
Open conspiracy was an idea which was really created by H.G. Wells in the late 1920s, when he toured European intellectual places, notably the Sorbonne, and he spoke to a meeting in the Reichstag, and he was trying to encourage intellectuals to think about changing the ethics of the Western world, and to do so without, if you like, insulting religion or the churches, and focusing attention upon ways in which behavior could be changed without having political battles. This was a move towards, if you like, thinking constructively for ordinary people, how they could have their lives changed, particularly through the licensing law system, but also in the criminal law and education systems of West European countries.
What did they do? How did this work in practice?
Well, H.G. Wells realized straight away that he was lousy at organization. He quite openly admitted that he couldn't organize anybody. So he had a good friend, Cyril Joad, who was to achieve fame during the Second World War as the BBC's radio philosopher, with regular programs about philosophical issues. And it was he in 1931-32 who planned the undertakings for the open conspiracy, things to be reformed, a whole list, which he published initially in his own autobiography, but then republished it in a manifesto, a book just called A Manifesto. And this set the list of things for intellectuals, notably in Britain, to think about getting behind. And these range widely from opening up the outdoors to open access, to medical reforms, including decriminalisation of abortion, of homosexuality amongst men, but also he wanted to encourage looking at poverty, especially amongst children, and to get behind a particular program being mooted by a Scottish nutritionist, which inevitably led to the provision of fortified meals in schools, and notably with free milk, which was to become the mark of the humanist movement.
And I think the idea in your book says the idea was based on the observation that there were lots of progressive causes all
Yes.
around the country, lots of local and lots of niche concerns, which were all under, as it were, a progressive umbrella, and who together it constituted a very potentially powerful network, but they needed bringing together. That's the point, isn't it?
Yes, and Cyril Joad was moving force behind the formation of the Federation of Progressive Societies and Individuals, the FPSI, which was organized loosely around many people who were members of Conway Hall and the Rationalist Association and South Place Ethical Society, but also those who were in the Ethical Union. And so, in a way, what Joad was trying to do was to maximize support from different organizations, most of them London-centered, it must be said, but he made a great play of putting his opening letter and invitation into the Manchester Guardian, not one of the London papers, nor the New Statesman. But in that way, there was a hope that Britain as a whole would be a united landscape upon which ethical change could be agreed upon and move forward in voluntary organizations, but with time through Parliament.
So there was, in a sense, a new organisation, the Progressive Movement, the Progressive League, and that, of course, carried on. I remember attending the very last meeting of the Progressive League in the 2000s, I think it was, or a little the 2010s, very much. I think it was the 2000s. And there were some people there, I'm sure none of them are alive now, but they looked like they might have been there since H.G. Wells came up with the idea. But that was just an organisation, and there were other organisations, as you say. But what you're really noticing and writing about in your book is the network. So
Yeah.
if the origins of the network are as you described it, how did it work? How did the net before Maddie asked you more about the actual campaigns and causes? How did it work? This network existed. It was being built in this way that you've described on a sort of blueprint by H.G. Wells. But how does it work in practice? What was it? What have you uncovered in your book?
The intellectuals became energized by individuals who were in Parliament, either in the House of Commons or many of them were in the Lords, who were willing to bring forward backbenchers bills which could stand without parliamentary parties taking sides. And one of the first to do this in Parliament was John Boyd Orr. One of the first intellectuals to get properly organised was a Scottish nutritionist, John Boyd Orr, who embarrassed government by showing in an experiment in British cities that approximately half of all children in the UK were malnourished. And he insisted upon creating a system of free school milk. Initially, the milk wasn't entirely free. It was subsidized, but by the time of the Second World War, it was free. And he became the planner of introducing free milk alongside diets for school lunches, which would provide extra strong nutrition and accelerate growth, particularly amongst very young children, those aged between about 3 and 6 years of age. This became singularly successful. Children were shooting up and doctors became very enthusiastic. And the system was quickly exported to many countries in North America, South America especially, and with time into Africa as well. So this was not an ethical move as such, but it showed how intellectuals, whether they come from sciences or from humanities, how they could influence Parliament towards new ways of improving the conditions of the population.
And that was in the 1930s, the Milk Act. So over the next 40 years, you're saying this network was operating.
Yes, the network became more complex and attracted new recruits. The scientists became interested, first of all, in the 1930s. A number joined the Spanish Civil War in the late 1930s and became concerned with the very poor systems that existed for protecting the civil population from bombardment, either by aircraft or by artillery. And they started to design new bunkers and to impress upon, first of all, the British government, then overseas governments, to think about their people and to provide bunkers which would provide much more improved protection than the idea which became common in the Second World War in Britain of the tin sheds out in back gardens, which really did not provide an awful lot of protection. With the war becoming more imminent, there were those scientific intellectuals who were interested in practical terms to provide protection for the people. But others were moving into other areas which were more based on controversial themes, notably the nuclear research program, which was started initially in Nazi Germany, and very quickly a group of German physicists persuaded the American government to establish what became known as the Manhattan Program, to try and build a nuclear bomb that would be in place before Hitler's Germany had it. And that attracted a large number of British, Australian nuclear physicists who were scooped up and to various places in the United States where the Manhattan Program was undertaken. So scientists were moving in some big areas of activity, whilst others were moving into areas such as the treatment of prisoners in prisons. They were concerned with particular condition in which women were being held in prisons. And this led to considerable pressure being put on the government indirectly through what became most associated with Amnesty International in the 1960s, the system of writing letters to prison governors and saying, the conditions in your prison are awful. You have to change this. And this proved to be remarkably successful in the 1950s for British pressure groups. And this became the model for amnesty in the 1960s.
I think this is what struck me so much reading the book, is this kind of staggering array of reforms and areas of change that these figures were involved in. And not just the ones that I think we've come to often associate with humanist activists and intellectuals, things like reproductive rights, for example, and the decriminalisation of male homosexuality, those things that we've talked about. But these other things and this corrective that you present in the book, which is that not all of these good things were the result of Christian activists or the kindness of the church or the goodness of the bishops in the House of Lords. In fact, many of them were hampered by those very things and very concepts. So really pinpointing the humanist kind of both, I guess, ideology and also individuals at the heart of these reforms, the kind of engine of this ethical reform being that and those individuals and their networks and communities that they had around them. But also that, as I say, the corrective to other historians who've come before, who've either grouped these people by, for example, their political affiliations, their socialism, for example, or, as I say, kind of downplayed or neglected the role of humanists in certain things. So I don't know if you want to pull out or mention some of those specific causes that maybe people do know less about the humanist role in. I'm thinking things like suicide or campaign for nuclear disarmament or civil liberties, these things that I think have often been really overlooked in terms of the humanist contribution.
That applies particularly to CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, which in much of the historical literature, even to this day, you will see expressions like this was a Christian movement, not wholly, but predominantly Christian, when in point of fact it was organized by a group of humanists who congregated around the editor of the New Statesman, Kingsley Martin. The first meeting of the CND Executive Committee was, in fact, in his house, 1 Robert Street, just to the south of the Strand. And there were those who attended, other than a visiting American, they were all British humanists. And the accounts of who were there quite clearly indicate that there were, at that stage, the foundation stage of CND, there were no Christians present at all. I've actually made a very recent discovery of somebody who was there who was not recorded by other people. The only woman there was a novelist, Doris Lessing, another humanist. And she doesn't mention speaking at the meeting, but she was present. So she must have been invited, and I'm presuming by Kingsley Martin, who engineered this meeting. I might just switch hat to another one, the Homosexual Law Reform Society. This is often again attributed to some radical Christians, but in fact, it was humanists who were the founders of the executive committee of the Homosexual Law Reform Society, led by Jacquetta Hawkes, who was an archaeologist and the wife of the playwright. J.B. Priestley. And the committees of that organization met in their flat, Jacquetta Hawkes's and Priestley's flat, just off Piccadilly, in a building which is known as the Albion Building. And that became the name of their charitable trust behind the Homosexual Law Reform Society. Changing hat again, just one other example. There are so many. One interesting guy who worked more or less on his own, didn't have an organization behind him at all, was the broadcaster Ludovic Kennedy, who became extremely influential during the 1950s and the 1960s in pursuing travesties of justice, wrongful conviction of murderers. Notable, first of all, with the execution of the wrong killer of the murders at 10 Rillington Place. And the way he operated was by writing a book, often accompanied by a television program. And he was the person who was responsible more than any other for getting the innocent freed and the guilty finally imprisoned in some cases, at that time also executed. So, but he was unusual, working on his own, a journalist who had judges in his family. And he knew how the system of the police influence upon judges in the courtroom were often not for the best interest of individuals being accused. That was unusual. Most campaigns depended on the creation of organizations who campaigned to get, in some cases, acts of parliament passed. And that applied in homosexual law reform, in divorce law reform, and these became the object of free votes in the Commons and the Lords. But by that method of depoliticizing, those who were not interested didn't vote, didn't even turn up. And that was particularly noticeable amongst the 26 bishops of the House of Lords. In many of these votes, they didn't turn up at all. In one case, there was an issue requiring a vote, and only one of the bishops turned up. And he only turned up because he was down to say the daily prayer in the Lord's. And that was the only reason he was there.
One of the most interesting things about the book is, and it obviously is in the tradition of your writing on these things so far, is that you've uncovered the way in which people operated, not necessarily behind the scenes, because it wouldn't be fair to say that they were deliberately trying to be hidden hands. They were open, they were writing letters and attempting to influence public opinion as well. But they did operate somewhat as an elite network. And I think that is quite interesting, not least because many of them were politically socialist, although of course there are liberals as well. But one of the things that you uncover is that, motivated by their humanism and not by their party politics, as Maddie was saying, they wanted to effect a transformation on the legal framework that embodied, as it were, public morals, more than they wanted to effect a transformation of public morals itself. I mean, it's quite a top-down effort. Did they themselves ever criticize themselves for that, or were they just sort of humanists know best type moral reformers. He thought it was their job. And because talking about some people here as well who are not just elite, they're really rich. I mean, like someone like H.G. Wells is one of the richest men around at the time. And you've referred several times, I know London prices in property in central London weren't quite then what they are today, but they've got flats in the Strand and flats off Piccadilly, and they're going to each other's houses for dinner parties and so on, having lunch. They've got quite a lot of leisure to pursue these campaigns. And so although their campaigns are obviously, as they would see it and as we would see it, to the benefit of everybody else, whether it's marriage and divorce or sexual and reproductive freedoms or penal reform or disarmament or censorship or racial justice or mental health or all the many causes that they were involved in, there is an elite aspect to this, isn't there?
Yes, that is true.
Did they feel that at all
Yes. The historian A.G.B. Taylor commented on this quite extensively. He notes in his autobiography that CND did not emerge in the format which they anticipated. They thought it was going to be a small organization headed by intellectuals who could chap on the doors of the rich and famous and get an elite organization to challenge the government's move towards nuclear armaments. It was quite a surprise to them when tens of thousands of people turned up for the London to Aldermaston March, for instance. They anticipated it was going to be perhaps a couple of hundred, but 10,000 turned up and continued to do so every Easter. So, yeah, I mean, A.G.B. Taylor gave the game away in a way that it was the last time, he said, when an elite tried to change the law of the country. And it's kind of gone out of fashion for an elite to do this.
At least in a liberal direction.
Yes, they didn't quite know what to do when there were large numbers coming to their talks. But although Taylor, give him his due, he reckoned that he did more talks in favour around the country in favour of nuclear disarmament of anybody. He was at the forefront for the number of talks given.
They did also it just struck me when you were talking about Ludovic Kennedy, but also I think this is another thing I really found very interesting about the book was that, yes, on the one hand, they're operating in, they're having dinner parties. H.G. Wells is inviting Olaf Stapledon to lunch to settle the whole damn silly universe and,
yes,
all these great things that they were saying to each other, half tongue in cheek or not. But also, Ludovic Kennedy was a broadcaster and a writer. He, chaired a conversation between, Leo Absey and Glanville Williams,
yes,
about assisted dying in a televised debate. Or Eustace Chesser is, another one who was behind the scenes helping to or attempting to shift public opinion by advising Marjorie Proop's the agony aunt. And it's kind of like those things I think are really interesting too, because there is a level, obviously, and a truth in that idea within the book that it was like change the laws first and then hopefully public opinion will catch up. But
yes,
they were also trying to change public opinion in these different ways. And in some ways, again, from quite a privileged position that maybe humanists don't have in quite such an obvious way now, where they were able to have these debates on TV. They were writing columns, writing books. They were on the radio, not always
editing the New Statesman.
Yeah, editing
yes,
the New Statesman. So I think there's something really interesting there too about these different ways they were doing it. Some of it very much was parliamentary and other parts of it were, let's have this debate between two intellectuals who are humanist and then another moderator that happens to be humanist as well.
Yes. One thing to be said about the press, there was quite a number of journalists in the network. Peter Ritchie Calder was one, but also Kingsley Martin and his wife. The thing about this, particularly the New Statesman, during the editorship of Martin from 1930 through to 1960, the New Statesman had two kind of polarities. One was supporting left-wing Labour, but the other was it was developing a kind of ethical outlook, and a lot of articles in the New Statesman at that time were on ethical issues, and in a way which New Statesman I don't think has sustained anymore. After Kingsley Martin resigned as editor in 1960, the paper moved very much towards a Christian position, albeit a Christian socialist position, to which by and large, it has remained. It has regular religious columnists, which Kingsley Martin really essentially did not encourage in the mid-20th century. It was definitely a humanist-orientated ethical paper. So, yes, the campaigns were wide. And one of the points that you make is that there was an attempt to encourage all networkers to support each other, so that on a particular issue, there would be those who were leading it, say homosexual law reform, that were 3 or 4 key individuals who were promoting that, but having a larger group joining the Homosexual Law Reform Society to encourage the spread of the ideas within the intellectual groups in the UK. There were always new causes. One you mentioned earlier is suicide, which had a very rocky route towards success. The issue being here that until 1961, attempted suicide was a crime in England and Wales, believe it or not, and large numbers of individuals, many of them very distressed, mental health conditions, were imprisoned, which humanists thought was not constructive. It didn't help the individuals, who often made repeated attempts at suicide. And the major obstacle in that case was quite clearly the Church of England. The Church of England had forged the criminalisation of attempted suicide, and the Church of England had to be confronted openly that this was not acceptable. And that was a complicated story, and one which, in the end, was passed through Parliament in 1961, when essentially the Church of England hierarchy gave up and said, yes, this is wrong. We should not have criminalised. But it was getting that admission of being wrong, and that was what the campaigners managed to do.
There was obviously something that brought all this together. I mean, they are a broad range of reforms and a broad range of people too, with their interests in supporting each other. But Hector Horton referred to this period in British life in particular as the humanist revolution, and he said that there'd been a progressive secularization of life, and it had changed consciousness. Whether that change in consciousness followed the legal changes that the elites had wrought, or whether it was part and parcel of them, or whether they were happening, one was the handmaiden of the other, or they're happening at the same time, whatever. Hector Horton's point was, this is a big change. It's a huge change. It's a wholesale change. And it goes along with and underpins these legal changes, that people no longer think there's a God. Even if there is a God, the God doesn't intervene, and human beings have got to solve their own problems, and morality has to have a human-centered focus. Do you see it as a revolutionary period, as not just the work of this network, but in your other historical research? Do you see this as the revolutionary period, 1930 to 1980?
Yes, I think hitherto I've focused too much just on the 1960s. A lot of things came to fruition in the 1960s. And that's why a lot of historians are drawn to, that's the real turning point. Also because of very large numbers of social commentators have pointed to the conservatism of the 1950s that preceded the 60s, including novelists. Doris Lessing's one who wrote extensively about the tediousness of, even in London in the 1950s, cinemas were closed on Sundays, and pubs closed at 9 o'clock or 9:30 in some parts of the country. Looking back, I would point to how the intellectual impetus behind this movement was really gathering steam from the early 1930s, without necessarily getting a great deal of success in the 30s. But groups were forming and were supporting each other. And interestingly, I put in the succession of dates in the book when new organizations were formed. Abortion Law Reform Association in 1936, the Euthanasia Society in 1937, and almost every year in the 1930s there was a new organization formed and setting about its own campaigning, usually amongst elites or amongst professional elites. One group obviously is the doctors, both over abortion and homosexual law reform. It was important to get the BMA on the side of ethical change, because There's the one set of organizations government was giving head to. It was the professionals. So you had to get the professionals to change their ethical views. And that took time. And it was on suicide, for instance, the BMA didn't change its position until the early 1950s. But once it had done so, it became really difficult for the Church of England to resist the pressure of medics that attempted suicide should not be regarded as a crime.
So how big was their impact, do you think, of this network of individuals? What's the legacy of it, of this, whether we call it a humanist revolution or an open conspiracy or whatever?
Well, there's a whole succession of acts of parliament, which are listed in the book, which many of them came in the 60s, some in the 70s. Occasionally, it wasn't even an act of parliament. It was just a vote in the Commons. For instance, the abolition of capital punishment. That was down to just a vote, of one for each house, although it was the Commons was the most important. So some issues didn't need an act, just a decision, and government agreed that if Parliament voted a particular way, then it would enact the required changes to the organisation of government. There were some things that lasted a bit longer into the early 1980s, some issues. The last member of my network of 94 individuals to be still active in campaigning into the early 1980s was Barbara Wootton, who in 1959 was elected the first woman in Parliament and almost immediately the first woman in the woolsack in the House of Lords. Her role, I think, has been underestimated by lots of people. To start with, I thought she was focused on certain key issues to do with criminal behaviour amongst children. She was a magistrate from the mid-1920s on. She was a magistrate in a London court before she even had the vote, because women only got the vote if they were over 30. She had a whole succession of issues which to do particularly with children. She was the first to bring a bill before Parliament to abolish corporal punishment. She also had a particular concern for the laws of consanguinity, which the Church of England had long controlled. That is, how cousins could not marry and certain relationships. Her position was that blood relationships are one thing, but non-blood relationships, she could see no good ethical reason for preventing non-blood relations from marrying. And she pursued that relentlessly on her own in the Lords during the late 1970s and into the early 80s. The bill that she presented in 1982 failed, but 2 years later, the almost identical bill was brought forward by the government. And from that point on, where there's no blood relationship, people may marry.
And some things, of course, still haven't changed. Assisted dying is a good example. As you know, some only very recently changed beyond the scope of 1980. For example, corporal punishment of children in schools. That was a bit later. And some, like I say, assisted dying haven't changed yet. But I think you estimated in your book that 3/4 of the laws that touched on the UK-wide laws that touched on moral questions that were within the scope of this morality bracket had changed, and that was down in this 50-year period to this network. Why? I mean, you're obviously a brilliant scholar and you've got an excellent framework for thinking about this, but why do you think that, in historians' terms, this has been such a neglected network? I mean, you've suggested partly in what you've said that there was a tendency amongst some historians to read these people politically, so party politically as either socialists or liberals, not seeing what they had in common was their humanism. But also you've referred to some historians, I'm guessing with a Christian bent, trying to salvage some impact for the church in the liberal column in some of these changes. Or is it just that it's only now that serious historical scholarship is being applied to these relatively recent events? Why is it that the humanist element in these changes has been so invisible in the scholarship until now?
in large part, I think, because it was such a splintered field of activity, ethical campaigning. There was no single controlling organization, federation of the FPSI, organization that the Federation of Popular Societies and Individuals appeared in the 1930s to be a coordinating organization. But interestingly, when it set up committees, those committees were floated off. And so the Marriage and Divorce Law Reform Society became an independent entity, which Eustace Jesser floated off, and became very powerful and influential in his own right in the post-war period. So I think that there's a practical reason as well. The network almost certainly never met as a mass in the same building. A lot of meetings did take place, and 80% of them in Conway Hall. That was clearly the home of the ethical reform groups. But they met as individual groups, not as one group. And I only discovered the linkages between them when I went to look at their archives of correspondence. And I found H.G. Wells particularly was writing hither and thither around the country and overseas because he was so well known as an international figure. Some were very isolated. John Boyd Orr was at the University of Aberdeen, which is then as now, takes a long time to get to by train. And it was only when he, for a short period, was a member of Parliament for the Scottish University seat that he had actually a base in London. So it was a matter of almost luck to discover through connections by letter and by postcard. One popular form of communication was a blank postcard, no image on the side. And H.G. Wells was an important chivier of members of the network, sending postcards, asking them to take important action. But one of the things he did was to organize defense of John Boyd Orr, who was being attacked by particular political interests because he wanted to stabilize prices for agricultural products, which farmers did not want. And so he asked the editor of the New Statesman, Kingsley Martin, to get behind John Boyd Orr, to put up a robust defense of an ethical position on food.
I wondered also if one of the reasons why history is only now coming around to it is because their success was in a way so complete. When you've got, but by the late 20th century, and in your book, I think one of the latest people you talk about is Mary Warnock, not as a member of this network, but as someone whose career and work is the sort of the fruits of the success of this network in a way. And I think that seemed to me as I was reading your book that there was part of it too, was that, one of the reasons why history has taken a while to notice this is because not only do they operate at an elite level and in a way that only now is clear looking at their correspondence, long after they're dead, but also that they had such a comprehensive victory. It's all their position on all of these questions. Although, of course, there is still a dissenting minority in the country in opinion polls that we can see, their position on all of these questions is now the common sense. So it's very easy then, isn't it, for institutions that have an interest, especially churches, to go, oh yes, we were there as well, all along, us too, this is how it's always been or how it is. Whereas actually the change that they've effected belies the difficulty of effecting it in the first place and the hard work that they had to do, even though they were incredibly leisured and privileged. Very hard work.
Also, it's worth observing that as intellectuals, they had a power base of their own, because in their own field of activity, their own science or journalism, they were willing to stand on a soapbox and say things which would attract brickbats from clergy, from Archbishop of Canterbury. So, in a way, it was more difficult for members of Parliament, particularly the elected members in the Commons, to expose themselves.
That's an interesting point as well about the historiography, because so many of them were scientists. And of course, when scientists are written about by historians, they're written about as scientists, just as the socialists are written about as socialists and not again as humanists, which is what united them all.
Yes. The scientists were a group who had particular causes to save ways of saving lives. Also worth mentioning, a group we haven't mentioned, the legal profession. who were in the group. Dennis Pritt, Sidney Silverman. For 20 years, Sidney Silverman organised the votes against capital punishment. And in the end, it was him who called the vote. So the legal profession, they were more radical, I think, then than we regard them now. Their organisation, the Haldane Society, which formed in 1937, every meeting of their society, where papers were read, was attended by a special branch officer taking notes. Lawyers were seen as dangerous radicals, particularly because of their support of freedom movements in the Commonwealth, in India, Pakistan, and West Africa. So the causes did have political implications. And where politics mattered, yes, the powers that be would seek to intervene.
It's hard to draw this to a close because there are, as I said at the start, this absolutely staggering number, not just of reforms in areas of change, but also individuals. But to make it even harder, I'm going to draw us to a close by asking, as we always do, Callum, who is your favourite atheist or humanist figure from this period?
Without a doubt, Barbara Wootton. She was a woman who was the object of abject derision from right-wing journalists. There was one particular journalist, now dead, who pursued her relentlessly for the Illustrated London News, went down to her house in the countryside where she kept donkeys. And an article came out just ridiculing her and her donkeys, which she keeps. And the photographer that went with the journalist arranged Barbara Wootton to sit in her broken greenhouse in her garden, where there was weeds growing through the middle of it. She was obviously not a gardener. But if she'd had supporters, they would have gone and protected her from journalists who ridicule for copy. I mean, she had such a wide range of issues. Corporal punishment, capital punishment. She took over bills that others abandoned in the Lords. She stepped forward and introduced them. And I feel she's a more important figure in the ethical history of the UK than of the political history. Yes, there's a lot of biographical work done on her in relation to her left-wing politics, but I believe it's as an ethicist, as somebody with a program to do good, especially for children, that she stands out.
She did fall out, didn't she, with quite a few people in the humanist movement. I remember when I first started working at Humanist UK, or the British Humanist Association, as it then was, there were still people darkly muttering about Barbara Wootton letting them down on abortion. I think, was it abortion? They felt that
she stepped down as a patron, didn't she, over that
of the Rationalist
issue.
Yeah.
Well, she stayed in the Rationalist Association.
Oh, did she? So it was
us.
Yeah.
Oh, really? Oh.
And
cross out her name.
Yes. It's very strange, and I haven't sorted in my mind yet what happened. She introduced the abortion law reform bill in the Lords. She introduced it and spoke about it in this first version, but then abandoned it for the second version. There is one theory which has been floated, not by me, by another scholar, that she had been forced by her second husband to have an abortion. Now, there's no evidence for this that I know of, but the argument is that she acted like somebody with a deep and profound sense of guilt and changed her position. I've not come to a complete resolution about Barbara Wootton on that, but I don't think it's fair to be angry with her over one issue when she did so much.
I mean, she was an amazing woman by anyone's standards. Maddie, who's your favourite out of the period we're talking about?
Well, I was about to say it was a struggle because my instinct was to say Dora Russell again.
You're always saying Dora Russell.
I know, and exactly, and I've said her before, so I won't say Dora Russell. But I think I will say May Seaton Tiedemann, who I don't think I've said before. But I know Callum in the book talks particularly about the work that these maybe slightly later set of reform, a set of humanist reformers that built on work of some of those who'd come before. And of those, Maisie and Tiedemann is a major figure. She was really significant in the Union of Ethical Societies, as Humanists UK then was. But she was also an absolutely devoted divorce law reform campaigner, standing on her soapbox in Hyde Park every weekend for years and years. Even though she herself was very happily married, it was very rooted in this idea of injustice, of the barriers that women faced in getting out of marriages that were unhappy or unsatisfactory for many different reasons. And also in listening to people. She talked often in her interviews about how she heard these stories from all these people who came to her unable to get divorced for these reasons that really were archaic and rooted in attitudes that seemed out of step. And for her, divorce law reform was a rational reform. It was a common sense reform. It was completely rooted for her in her kind of humanist values and her sense that justice should be for all. And so, I love her, Maisie and Tiedemann.
Very good.
And who's your favourite?
I'm going to choose Jacquetta Hawkes, who we've already mentioned, because I quite like to have been her, really. That's a good reason to choose. Well, she's so amazing. She has this incredibly interesting academic career, and the first woman to do the archaeology and anthropology work that she did. And she's got an enormous intellectual hinterland. At the same time, she interests herself, like Barbara Wootton, as you're saying, so many different sort of progressive causes in which, again, she doesn't have much of a personal investment in terms of her own life. She's not a gay man, she's not, and so on and so forth, all the causes that she particularly pioneered, but she does it, and also has time to host amazing martini evenings and dinner parties and co-organise the Festival of Britain and just be incredibly glamorous and wonderful.
She was also a key figure in Britain's entry to UNESCO. She was the British promoter of UNESCO.
Had a sort of commitment that I think it's nice when humanists have this, which I think Roy Jenkins also had, not just to sort of progressive causes, righting injustices, but to a civilised life. Like she did things like the preservation of rural England and chaired the campaign for restoring William Shakespeare's birthplace, and just believed in in beautiful things for people all around them. Always remember Roy Jenkins when he spoke about bringing everyone together in a progressive way. He always said, we must always casually, he'd always add like the campaign for the preservation of rural England or for architectural beauty in together with homosexual law reform and divorce law reform to make made the point that this was about having a good life in the round for everyone. And so I like that about her too. Well, there we are. One of the interesting things about all the people in your book, Callum, is that they've all got very broad interests. They're all interested in a huge range of policies and changes, a bit like the humanist movement today, which again has a broad platform, frustratingly so sometimes, exhaustingly so sometimes. We can't recommend your book enough, I think, can we, Maddie? We both enjoyed it. I think everybody should buy it. If you're listening to this podcast and you've not yet bought a copy, please do, or rather, given that it is a bit of an expensive purchase, request it from your local library.
Yes.
Because that is an option and is
perhaps Callum will then benefit from the Public Lending Right Act, which humanists also helps to secure back in this
period.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Maureen Duffy herself. Bridget Brophy.
Yeah. They were everywhere, in every liberal cause.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
But if people are waiting for the book to arrive at their local library, having requested it immediately on listening to this, where else might people find out about your work, Callum?
Yeah, my work is best explained by a Wikipedia entry, which has recently been put up, which explains the transition. I started life as a historian of religion. I'm now a historian of anything but religion.
Thank you, Callum, for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Unholy Histories, the Humanist Heritage podcast, brought to you by Humanist UK. To join, support, or find out more about Humanist UK's campaigns and services, visit humanists.uk, or you can follow us on social media at Humanists UK. This podcast was produced by Humanise Live. Find out more about creating content for compassionate communities at www.humanise.live.
And you can find out more about the rich history and influence of humanism on the Humanist Heritage website at heritage.humanist.uk.